Well, I seem to have lost the plot about 2 bosses ago. I'm flying through space right now, everything's on fire, and you know what? This is fine. Welcome to Worst ARPG Ever, a series inspired by Josh Strife-Hayes, and today we're looking at the pixel art ARPG Hero Siege, which just got a huge update, known as 2.0. Now, the astute among you may notice that throughout this I'm playing offline. That's because I ran into some issues trying to play online. Totally understandable for a launch day on a big patch, but I just didn't want to deal with it. If there was an offline mode, I decided, you know what, I can play through, get a feel for the game, and that's what I did. I'm going to be approaching it as a new player because I've never played Hero Siege before, so I don't have any preconceptions about what Hero Siege was. I'm just going to look at it for what Hero Siege is right now. I'll start by talking about the new player experience, move on to the gameplay and systems, and then, if I make it to endgame, talk about that as well. And so let's get into it, because this game feels very Diablo 2, and I fear if I wait any longer, Deckard Cain's gonna start to miss me. So first up, upon loading in, there's a lot of different class options, including old ARPG favorites like Warrior, Pyromancer, and the Redneck. That's right, I remember when I played a Redneck in Diablo. There's also quite a few DLC classes, but more about that later. You begin without any items, and speaking of, I walked right past the staff on the ground I was supposed to pick up, and began punching the undead. Luckily, punching the undead did seem to be a fairly effective tactic, so I was saved from my own incompetence by the tutorial being easy. Don't worry, I did then realize that the staff was there, went back, picked it up, and began bonking with style instead of just punching. As I continued through the area, there were plenty more zombies to bonk over the head. And overall, this isn't a bad introductory experience. Hopefully it teaches me everything I need to know, but it definitely gave me enough experience that I leveled up and grabbed Fireball. Then I tried to use Fireball, and I found out that, much like playing a Sork in D4, you don't have very much baseline mana regen, and your Fireballs don't do all that much damage, at least relative to your melee attacks. So I grabbed some energy and still lacked mana, and then went back to smacking things with my weapon. Now luckily, Hero Siege did not make this a very punishing experience. I learned roughly how spells and mana work, the fact that mana was gated without more significant investment later, and also I got to respect my character for a few gold that I picked up off the floor. So no issues here thus far. But I will say the game felt very Diablo and even used the Diablo font. As I continued through the zone, I encountered a burning tree, and this is a pretty cool area mini-boss. I started off by kiting it because I was a little scared. I mean, things in ARPGs tend to hit pretty hard, and it didn't do all that much damage to me. I'm not sure if this is because I got lucky or if because I was in the tutorial zone. So I kited it back, fireballed it, smacked it, and that was the end of that. Fireball wasn't too specialized at the moment, I was mostly just focusing on strength for bonking stuff, but Fireball did a little bit of damage and I had the mana, so might as well use it. Then in town, I went to look through my stash stuff and encountered a purchase. Yep, you can buy stash tabs for $5, which feels a little bit weird and out of place in an indie game that I just bought. But anyway, I'm sure that's not a big deal. I picked up a few quests and on to the next area, where I noticed some copper ore, and this leads to a small gathering minigame. Now first, I messed it up because I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do. I thought it was a quick time event style thing, where you tap it and you fill a green circle or something and you win. No. You have to tap it when the yellow circle is within the green circle. And after I figured that out, mining is pretty easy. I'm sure I'll find a use for the ores later. It was pretty fun, though I could see it getting old if you have to do it a couple hundred times. And in the next zone, there were plenty more zombies and skeletons to mow down, but I did notice clicking items can be a little awkward. Now, early on in my playthrough, I didn't know how to fix this. Later on, I found out there's a menu option to see item text. And on the one hand, just having the icons is absolutely more immersive, but it felt like a real pain to click around. I don't know if that's because my mouse is fairly high sensitivity, or I'm just bad at clicking. Either way, it definitely feels like item names should be on by default. It was at about this point where I encountered a big glowy enemy, so of course I did what you'd expect I'd do. I killed it, and I got a satanic item. And at this point I wasn't really sure what satanic items were, but it was certainly quite cool to get one, and unfortunately it required level 15. Being around level 5, it felt quite a long way off. So I continued along my journey of undead genocide, since that seemed like the best way to gain experience. And along the way, I found a gun. Using the power of gun, I decimated some enemies. I don't know if this is just me, but the gun felt way stronger at low levels than a melee weapon. And there was no mana cost, so my spells felt pretty darn redundant. I then respec my character to try to maximize my range damage, which again was very easy. I have to say, while I may have some complaints about Hero Siege, respecs is absolutely not one of them. From here, the rest of the area was pretty easy. I chewed through more enemies and collected several items. I learned that killing enemies may not be the best way to get loot though. Instead, it was clicking on these little piles of logs. They'd kinda clunk down, drop some stuff, and usually the items would be of a higher quality, similar to if I killed a rare glowy enemy. I'm not exactly sure what the rare glowy enemies are called, I'm just going to keep calling them rare and glowy since that's what they look like. I also noticed that items on the floor have a really nice effect. Superior items glow blue, rare items glow yellow, mythic glow purple, and satanic glow red. Plus, it's really easy to see mythic and satanic items on your minimap. You can also pick up charms. Ah yes, I too remember chugging mana potions and filling my inventory of charms in D2. I'm sure D2 will be on a future episode, so stick around if you like what you've heard so far. And this is where the game, to me, felt a little bit weird, because I'm filling my inventory with charms, but the way to get more inventory space is to buy it for $5. And I'm not sure why. I've bought a game, I need to buy stash tabs, and I also need to buy inventory space when the game is telling me to fill my inventory with charms. I don't think I'd have an issue with these things being for sale if they felt very optional. But at this point, I'd played the game for well under an hour, and I'd already been asked to purchase things multiple times just as I was clicking around and going through the gameplay. Unfortunately, it really feels like instead of the DLC or additional content being added on top, the game was cut apart, parceled out, and then sold separately. But anyway, enough of those depressing thoughts, because I found a mini area, and that mini area was full of rats. So I quickly got surrounded because the game's movement is a tidbit awkward. And luckily, I found out that at this level, I can absolutely face tank the enemies. In some ways, this is going to be a theme that continues through the game. I also found the boss and face tanked it. So upon returning to town, I immediately gave Sarcaster his coffee beans. First of all, his name's Sarcaster, so he's the best NPC. Second of all, denying him coffee would be inhumane. In town, I found out that I had a house, which is awesome. I didn't know I had a house, and very few ARPGs have player-owned housing. Except I don't have a house. I have the option to purchase the house. Not for gold, for real-life money. This is now the fourth time in under an hour that the game has asked me for more money, and this feels very excessive, or at worst, a bit desperate. After looking around town a bit more, turns out I missed a quest. I had to mine 20 copper ore. So it's time to head to the fields of battle, and hopefully there's going to be some copper ore. As it turns out, there was, which is nice. I also found out that I can tank a lot of enemies, except not the acid pools from the maggots. Those hurt a lot. And so I died. This was my first death in the game, and it felt like it was completely my fault. Playing a bit more carefully, the zone went well. And I discovered that your weapons, including ranged weapons, continue attacking if you hold right click. This felt great. It got rid of a little bit of awkwardness that I'd noticed while aiming at enemies before. Next up, I entered into the pumpkin patch where I needed to get some pumpkins to make nice maggot and pumpkin stew. A perfect October favorite, if I do say so myself. Progression at this point was still very smooth, and after reaching level 10, I unlocked a new ability, Fire Aura. This is a permanent aura that's active with no downside, and seems to deal ticking fire damage. And having Fire Aura redefined my gameplay for, well, the rest of my entire run. For the most part, I could run around and everything would passively die. But from time to time, I had to watch out, especially with rooms full of ranged foes. Because what I noticed is melee enemies could pretty much be ignored. Yeah, they'd hit me and sometimes they'd damage me, but most of the time they'd miss, and especially if I had a shield equipped, I'd be able to block, and their damage was trivial. Ranged foes, on the other hand, don't seem to be able to miss, as I'm guessing most of them are spellcasters, so rooms of ranged foes required me to kite, whereas rooms of melee foes I could pretty much face tank as they'd walk towards me and burn themselves to death. From here, my progress accelerated greatly. I burned my way through the king's garden, and confronted the king himself. This is the game's first boss. It presented some relatively simple mechanics. Fight the king, Some statues appear, you burn the statues, then the king continues to do his couple of moves, throws some rocks at you, drops some rocks on your head. You avoid them. You got a few ads or crowns or something towards the end that I, again, largely ignored. I had a lot of passive damage from my fire aura and took him out without any issues. Now, unfortunately, I didn't have my keybind set up correctly at this point, mostly because I either didn't read the tutorial on it or the game didn't properly tutorialize it, and I missed how you actually do it. This was definitely a skill issue on my part, and it wasn't an issue because the boss was pretty darn simple and straightforward. So after I took him out, on to the next area. And in a lot of ways, that's the entirety of Hero Siege. You play through a series of zones, come across a dungeon with sub-levels, fight the boss, and move on to the next act. It did get a little bit more difficult, and I did have a few deaths here or there, either to ranged enemies or bosses. I noticed when I died to a boss, the boss's health wouldn't reset, but I'd have to run back from the nearest waypoint, which was slightly irritating. I tried dropping portals, those didn't seem to persist through death, so my goal was to not die, and I respect most of my attribute points into vitality. Overall, it felt like a lot of my spells were pretty lackluster, at least for their mana costs, but auto attack did a good bit of damage, and passive spells like Fire Aura were great. The most awkward thing was movement, especially with my movement skill. That would give me an almost uncontrollable rush forwards, surrounding me in flames and stopping when I hit an enemy, a piece of a scenery, a wall, possibly a piece of loot. I don't think that last one's actually a thing. Pretty sure loot didn't have hitboxes, but it certainly felt like it with how many things I slammed into while careening around the map. That said, when my path was clear, I went incredibly fast through multiple areas, and it kind of allowed me to just boss rush. But as I continued on, I was able to keep relatively on level with things, and I beat the boss. By this point, because I had respect and put almost everything into vitality, I was more or less just face-tanking boss mechanics. They hit quite hard, and I'm sure this is a bad habit that I will regret later, but it was working, so everything's fine. After this, I entered Nightmare, and this is when Hero Siege began to change in a variety of ways which didn't make the game more enjoyable. Quite the opposite, unfortunately. First up, I finished with normal mode around level 50, but immediately I was prompted to fight level 60 plus enemies. At this point, the game's scaling had roughly been, you fight enemies on your level, or things a couple levels higher or lower than you. So to see things over 10 levels higher, my natural response was, of course, to grind levels. And that's what I did, going to about level 63. And then I cleared all of Act 1 without too much difficulty. I tried experimenting for a little bit with a mercenary, but I noticed he kept dying and he cost so much gold to resurrect that it simply wasn't worth it. So I decided to abandon that system because it felt pretty dead, or at the very least, I was missing something important about it. Again, the game didn't explain, and I didn't feel like going to look up a guide that may or may not be accurate, because Hero Siege as a game has changed so much that I couldn't trust any of the information I found online. But overall, my experience was still in the pretty good portion. Until I hit Act 2, and enemies jumped from the 60s to the 70s. As I got to Act 3, they jumped from the 70s to the 80s. As I progressed, my damage was not keeping up. And I fully admit, this could be a flaw of my own character playing the Pyromancer, or a flaw of the build that I chose. Maybe I was just doing it wrong. But it felt like what the game wanted me to do was slowly grind my way to 100, spending several hours running in circles in each zone, fighting enemies that I could easily kill, then clearing the next act slowly, before repeating this process. The scaling that before had made a lot of sense seemed completely thrown out the window. Yet again, I looked into the crafting a little bit, and this time even asked someone, who very kindly told me how it worked. But while the recipes existed, I hadn't saved any of my satanics, so I had no way to craft new items. The game had never really given me a quest. I could have easily missed it. I will admit there was definitely a point where I feel like I missed a bunch of quests or the game bugged out. And so I went through the somewhat painful process of just rushing through zones. Because I realized, yes, you lose EXP for dying, but boss health never resets, so you can kind of just painfully and slowly chip away at stuff. I'm sure I could have ground out 20, 30 levels and blasted through feeling more on par with the enemies and progressing fairly smoothly. But I didn't want to just run in circles for a while hoping I got better drops. That's not fun or enjoyable to me. I'm perfectly happy to replay a game like Armored Core 6, where both the story and the gameplay get recontextualized with each playthrough. But the gameplay wasn't changing in Hero Siege, certainly not enough to hold my interest. and the story completely lost itself about halfway through normal. And so, with about 12 to 15 hours of playtime, this is where I decided to put Hero Siege down. I'd beaten normal. I was actually on Nightmare Satan, but I wasn't enjoying my gameplay, and I realized it had been several hours since I last had fun. And so now, I want to move on to talking about some of the gameplay systems for people who are interested in the game, and then give it my final verdict. So overall, the gameplay mechanics are simple enough. You begin with skill points and attribute points. Put skill points into various skills. Each of his skills have synergies. If you take a synergistic skill, it increases the damage of all skills it synergizes with. Therefore, you kind of have pre-made builds that you can neatly slot into. Or alternatively, if you have good enough gear, you're able to freely mix and match. When it comes to attributes, you can pretty much freely respec these at any time. But overall, things like defense and vitality keep you alive, whereas something like intelligence increases your magic damage, strength your attack damage, etc. I found that additive damage to attacks was one of the best ways to scale auto-attacking. And overall, auto-attacking felt relatively powerful in most stages of the game, but it was purely single target, so you needed other skills such as spells for your AoE. When it comes to gearing, items start out very simple: additive damage, a couple resistances, basic stats like life and mana recovery, and then they get more complex. Satanic items have a variety of unique effects and often have enhanced stats. Plus, there seem to be set bonuses that offer crazy things like plus cold skill level, though I only encountered one of these, and I don't know if that's a pattern or if that's an unusual outlier. Then we have charms, things that sit in your inventory, taking up space and giving you passive bonuses. I really wouldn't mind the charm system if the game gave you suitable inventory space, and luckily it was quite intuitive that the yellowish section of the inventory is where the charms go. They even properly reorganized themselves. But with the game then asking me to buy more inventory space, it just felt artificial and cash grabby, like the whole point of charms was to clutter your inventory so you'd pay the developer money to fix the problem they designed. There are also relics. It seems like you could equip 4 relics, and I got them as random, fairly rare drops. And from everything I heard, looking up things about the game online, relics are really cool and a big part of character building. Unfortunately, I understood absolutely nothing about them, because I didn't get to see any of the stats when I was making the choice of which relic to equip, so I just kind of did it randomly. I mean, Satan's Eye sounds a lot cooler than having a chance to spread an infection when I'm hit. My goal is to not be hit, so I don't want to do that. But then again, maybe that's completely incorrect. Maybe the infection's overpowered and I made the wrong choice. After you equip one, the tooltip does show up, and it's genuinely excellent for all of the damage-based skills. The proc blah 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 on hit or when hit, unfortunately, still wasn't clear. I think the problem here is that the relics, like a lot of the other game systems, are designed for existing players. People who've played Hero Siege for 5 or 6 years and know not only which ones are best, but what each one does by heart. And once you reach level 100, there is an endgame progression system similar to Diablo 3's Paragon, which if you've ever heard me talk about Diablo 3's Paragon and how terrible it is, you'll know I am not a fan of. While I found a vast majority of the mechanics to be intuitive, there were a few that I found to be quite obtuse, and these are as follows. I saw the crafting cube, I tried to put some stuff in the crafting cube, nothing happened. Well, as it turns out, I was supposed to hit escape and click the book icon, which someone in my Discord very kindly told me, but I don't think I would have found that if it wasn't for someone just telling me. In fact, this is something I found to be a little bit weird about Hero Siege as a whole. There's surprisingly little information on the game, either in some sort of in-game tutorialized way or external resources. I could find very few YouTube videos or even Reddit posts, and that surprised me given how old the game is. But as far as I can tell, one of the reasons for this is the game's changed a lot since its first iteration. In the beginning, it was a roguelike game where you fought waves of enemies and upgraded your character, kind of Diablo-themed, I'd assume, but more like a Halls of Torment than what we see now. And then, my understanding from talking to people and reading Steam reviews, is it became more like a Path of Exile mapping simulator, where there wasn't necessarily that much of an endgame loop. You were pushing greater rifts similar to Diablo, but it was very fast-paced, the abilities functioned well, and you could attack while moving, which I have to say, if I could attack while moving, the game would have felt way better to me. So I'm kind of surprised that feature was removed. But that's not the feeling I get from playing Hero Siege 2.0. The feeling I get now is I'm playing a game that copied Diablo 2's homework, and did so in a way that could only be described as meticulous, where it not only brought some of the game's strengths over, but it also brought over all of the flaws. And if you have a lot of nostalgia for Diablo 2, that might feel very comforting. But personally, it pushed me away from continuing to play Hero Siege. In fact, the times where the game felt at its coolest was when I was doing things like finding satanic items, and not when I was doing things that were taken from Diablo 2, like managing charms in my inventory or looking up rune words, and then finding out that I didn't have enough sockets to actually make it anyway. Ultimately, Hero Siege left me with one feeling. It felt like someone took a lot of mechanics from Diablo and shoved them into a different game, but there was no real rhyme or reason. I felt like I was collecting charms because Diablo had charms. I felt like I was potentially going to have rune words because Diablo had rune words. But nothing felt unique, interesting, or integrated into the game in a holistic manner. I like that a lot of the enemies are quite varied, at least visually speaking. Most of them either attack you or shoot a single projectile at you. I like the fact that early on, you make meaningful progress on your character. You're picking different skills, speccing into different abilities, and looking at the stats on your gear in an attempt to piece together a build. Unfortunately, I feel like the skill customization aspect does fall apart a bit later. Like in Diablo 2, certain skills have synergies based on other skills, which means I felt pressured to use certain skills that synergized. Because I was using Fire Aura, I needed to use all the other Fire Aura-like skills. I couldn't just add in a Hydra because Hydra didn't get any of the damage scaling, and so I was spending my mana on something that was going to be less efficient. I'm sure for some classes and some builds there are ways around this, and especially with items, I'd guess you can enable powerful effects. But getting something like 100 or 200% increased damage for free certainly makes it easier to scale synergistic skills, which leads to a feeling of playing the developer's builds rather than playing your own. Aside of that, having rune words is whatever. Having charms is a bother and downright offensive when you're selling me inventory space. And the gameplay that started off relatively even-paced felt totally unbalanced once the enemies started to outscale my level by 30 or even 40. So if you're feeling really nostalgic for Diablo 2 and you want a game with nice pixel art graphics, then maybe you should check out Hero Siege. When it's on sale, it's about $5 for the base game, but there is a lot of DLC, including all the classes, stash tabs, and much, much more. And if you aren't looking to relive your Diablo 2 nostalgia, unfortunately, I don't think the game has a lot to offer at the moment. I'm sure there's going to be longtime players who say, "It gets good later. You should have gotten to the endgame, it's so much better." And again, that could very well be the case. But if a game isn't interesting enough to me right now, that I enjoy my time, I'm never going to get there. After my build came together, I felt very disengaged. The combat was quite binary. I got stuck on an enemy and died, or I didn't get stuck, walked in circles, the enemies died, and then I, mostly didn't click loot because I stopped picking it up, since most of it was garbage. I only picked up mythics and satanics. Those seemed pretty decent, and occasionally I would get an upgrade. Again, though, a lot of the time I just didn't bother because I was too low level to equip the upgrades I was getting as of Nightmare difficulty. I don't mind grinding when there's a goal, but for me, there was simply no goal in sight. And I feel like this is the problem when a game develops itself to cater to an existing audience, but then also simultaneously tries to branch out and bring in new players without laying the groundwork that a new player needs. But it could also be that Hero Siege 2.0 just isn't for me, and many of the things I mentioned may not be a problem for you. If that's the case, don't let my thoughts on the game take away from your enjoyment. If you're having fun, keep having fun. Just know when getting other people involved, the game could be a little bit of an acquired taste. And so I'm going to give Hero Siege a Cyberpunk Samurai, Avenger Paladin, Amazon, Demon Slayer Bundle, Shaman, Marauder, Plague Doctor, Extra Slots in Stash Space, Shield Lancer, Illusionist, and Gates of Valhalla out of 10. It's certainly not the worst ARPG I've ever played, but at the same time, I wouldn't really recommend it right now. But that said, 2.0 is quite new, and who knows, the game's changed a lot in the past, maybe it'll change for the better in the future. What are your thoughts on Hero Siege? Are you coming into 2.0 as a completely new player, or do you have 1,000+ hours, and if so, do you prefer the changes or not? And if you want to know my thoughts more broadly on games going from 1.0 to 2.0, and some of the things that I think developers make mistakes with, or some of the ways in which those changes are necessary but irritating to players, do be sure to get subscribed, as I'm going to be talking about that in a future video. On the other hand, if you're looking for an ARPG to play that I can absolutely recommend, then check out my thoughts on either Ghost Lore or Grim Dawn. Both are excellent titles, and I enjoyed my time with both of them. With that said, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for their continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this possible. And for $5 a month, you could see your name here right alongside these fine folks. Link to that is down below. But with that said, thanks again for watching, hope you learned something, and I'll see you again sometime soon.